Good evening and a very warm welcome to you all this evening from a rather chilly Edinburgh to our annual chaplaincy lecture. My name is Alister Donald and I'm the chaplain here at Heriot-Watt University. The chaplaincy lecture has been part of the public face of Heriot-Watt for a number of years and is our university's largest public-facing lecture. Present circumstances mean, of course, that we have to hold it online this year, but the pandemic crisis has also brought an opportunity. The numbers registered for tonight far exceed the capacity of our largest auditorium, and we are glad to welcome guests from well beyond Edinburgh and indeed well beyond the UK. Please would you note the following two things. First of all, a recording of the event is being made and will be available afterwards to attendees. In the event of any difficulty, please email us as follows: chaplaincy@hw.ac.uk. That's chaplaincy@hw.ac.uk. Secondly, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions after the lecture. This will be via the Q&A chat function of your screen, and I will then read out your questions before the speaker answers them. I now invite Professor Richard Williams, the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University, to tell you more about recent developments at Heriot-Watt and to introduce this evening's speaker.
Well, I'm very glad to extend my own welcome to you all this evening. Welcome to Heriot-Watt University, and in a moment or two I will be introducing our speaker. A word about the university. Our university, as some of you know, is quite unlike many others in several respects. As a charitable organisation, we operate as a global institution with 5 campuses in 3 countries. And we have a broad range of educational programmes and a rather pioneering attitude in enabling inclusion and access to our programmes. And in the research that we do that's intellectually deep, but applied and translated for the benefit of society. About 1/3 of our students study in Scotland, and the remainder being based in Dubai and Malaysia, and studying online from their homes and workplaces in over 150 countries. This year is a special one for us because we're celebrating our 200th anniversary of our predecessor institution, which was in fact the world's first Institute of Mechanics, which subsequently became Heriot-Watt College and then Heriot-Watt University. Well, we are now very much a multinational community with people of many faiths and none. And we're proud of having a tradition of being inclusive and of welcoming a diversity of culture and belief. And of course, this applies just as much to faith as to other expressions of diversity. So as we embark on our bicentenary year, please keep an eye on our website for events that are going to be part of our celebrations during this bicentenary year. And do join with us, as together we are intent on developing people who have a strong sense of individual purpose, along with our research outcomes that will shape the future of the next 200 years. Well, let me move on to say a little bit about our speaker tonight. Professor Aleister Mcgrath, who is the Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford, and he is also Director of the university's Ian Ramsay Centre for Science and Religion. And a little bit about his background. After initial academic work in the natural sciences, in which he gained a doctorate in molecular biophysics, Professor Mcgrath turned to the study of theology and intellectual history. He has a long-standing interest in educational issues and has developed a series of theological textbooks which are widely used throughout the world. He's also a prolific author on science and worldview matters and is equally at home in writing for a popular as well as an academic readership. With this very wide-ranging background and having himself undertaken a personal journey from atheism to Christianity, he's ideally qualified to engage in the debate about the relationship between science and religion. And As the numbers, I believe, attending tonight's lecture makes clear, this is the subject of ongoing interest to very many people. Aleister has engaged and debated with Richard Dawkins and has published responses to the work of his Oxford colleague. He's currently engaged in research about different attitudes of Dawkins and Albert Einstein to science and religion, and indeed he's going to be exploring this in the lecture. So as you can see, Professor McGrath is ideally qualified to give this year's special annual chaplaincy lecture, and I know that we're going to be in for a stimulating time and no doubt a really good discussion session afterwards. So Aleister, turning to you, it does give me very great pleasure to welcome you to this evening on behalf of Heriot-Watt University, and we're really looking forward to what you have to say to us on this topic, science, faith and the meaning of life, comparing Richard Dawkins and Albert Einstein. Over to you, Aleister. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Aleister Mcgrath, and I'm the Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you tonight, even though it's in this virtual way. Now, my own background is in the natural sciences. I grew up in Northern Ireland, specialised in natural sciences, then went to Oxford University to study chemistry in the early 1970s. But I've always been interested in far more than just the sciences. I'm interested in the big questions of life as well. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. And maybe I need to begin by exploring with you what that phrase, big questions, actually means. It's a phrase that's very widely used to refer to ways of thinking about ourselves and our world, which help us to make sense of things, to position ourselves within this world. And psychologists tell us it's actually a very natural thing for us to do. It helps us to cope with the complexity and the ambiguity of life. And there are lots of these big pictures. Some are religious, some of them are not. But the key point really is that big pictures help us to figure out meaning and values. But the point, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, is that meaning is not an empirical idea. It's not something that you can measure or detect. And that's why I think we need more than science. Science is wonderful at raising questions, but some of those questions will lie beyond its capacity to answer, such as the meaning of life. And I want to make it absolutely clear, look, it's no criticism of science to say that some questions lie beyond its reach. I'm sure you've all read the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, and he talked about ultimate questions, which he meant, questions like values, the meaning of life, what's a good life, how do I lead it? These are all really important questions. So this issue of meaning is really important. Here's how the psychologist Michael Steger explores this question. What does meaning mean, if I can put it like that? Well, Steger tells us it's all about, I quote, the extent to which people comprehend, make sense of, or see significance in their lives, accompanied by the degree to which they perceive themselves to have a purpose, mission, or overarching aim in life. Well, I think that's quite a helpful start to our conversation tonight. I mean, psychology might not be able to tell us what this big picture actually is, but psychology certainly tells us how important it is for us to find such a big picture to lead a meaningful and fulfilled life. So as you'll have gathered from the title, in this lecture tonight I want to explore some big questions about science and religion and the human quest for meaning. And obviously I'm going to tell you what I think, not because I'm right, but because I hope I'll be interesting and help you to think these things through. But I'm sure you'll agree with me, it's much more interesting if we engage with these questions in dialogue with other people, especially when these are really interesting. So I've chosen tonight two dialogue partners who I hope you will feel are interesting. They're both, of course, taken from the natural sciences. One of them is the physicist Albert Einstein, and the other is the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. So I, Richard Dawkins and Albert Einstein actually take very different positions on these questions. And my hope is that in exploring these questions with you, it'll give you a kind of framework to help you think these things through for yourselves. It's a big question, this issue of meaning, and how science fits into this question. I hope that offering you 3 reference points may be useful in figuring out what you yourself think. Let's just begin by sketching the 3 main schools of thought within Western culture concerning how science and religion relate to each other. So the first of these is the idea of a war. that in effect science and religion are in conflict, they're in war. This is of course the view of Richard Dawkins, and the argument is that science and religion are locked into conflict and science alone will emerge victorious. There's no point in a conversation. Indeed, if science and religion are at war with each other, then to do so would amount to intellectual treason. So we'll be looking at Richard Dawkins on this issue as we explore this tonight. But let's look now at an alternative, the second option, which is the image of a silo, the idea that science and religion are in effect completely separated. They're totally different areas of thought, and they can't and probably shouldn't enter into discussion with each other. They're like insulated compartments of the human mind which don't interact with each other. And one of the reasons I'm looking at Einstein tonight is that actually he fits into this category. Although he treats science and religion as being quite different, though non-interacting, he does argue that both of these need to be woven somehow into a bigger picture of life. So we'll look at that as we go along. Then there's a third position which I would represent, and that is that we can have a dialogue between science and religion. Now, science and religion are here seen as offering different perspectives on the great questions of life, which are capable actually of illuminating and informing each other. And this conversation can be both constructive and critical at one and the same time. And of course, this is the approach that I would take, although I have to tell you, when I was a teenager in Belfast back in the late 1960s, I was an atheist, and so was strongly attracted to the warfare model of their relationship. So briefly speaking, those are the three main approaches we can adopt. And obviously I'm going to introduce Einstein and Dawkins in a few moments, but I'll tell you a bit more about myself to get our conversation underway. During my teenage years, when I was growing up in Belfast, I specialised in the natural sciences because I knew I wanted to be a scientist. And as I did this, I found myself being drawn to a decidedly atheist big picture, and that was Marxism. I think looking back, I was drawn to Marxism because it offered me what then seemed to me to be a compelling worldview, which seemed to be able to make sense of human history, my own experience, and also, I think, give me a sense of place and purpose in the historical process. Now, of course, Marxism was hugely fashionable in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and so it was very easy for me as a sort of follower of intellectual fashion to get caught up in this euphoric mood of the age. However, it also fed into my thinking about science and religion, because I had fallen in love with science as a teenager, and I believed then that I had offered certain and reliable answers to all the great questions of life. Now, I was an atheist back then and saw natural sciences and atheism as being really like two sides of the same coin. And actually, that was just the way most people thought back then. The idea was that science and religion had always been locked in combat. To love science was thus to hate religion. Now, scholarship actually doesn't think this way anymore, but back then it did. And my Marxist friends assured me that this worldview was able to value and accommodate the natural sciences, although I have to tell you they didn't really quite explain to me how all this worked out in practice. Now, I'm a lapsed atheist now, but I want to make it clear I take atheism seriously and I hope respectfully. In fact, I'm fascinated by the complex interaction of atheism, Christianity, and the natural sciences. And that's what I want to explore in this presentation tonight. For me, Christianity offers me a big picture of reality. Now, you know, it's quite possible that my appetite for big pictures was whetted by my experience of Marxism. It made me want to have a big picture of what life was all about. But at that time, I didn't realize that Christianity had a capacity both to explain and transform life. That really was something I learned after I'd embraced Christianity and began to read C.S. Lewis, who helped me to see Christianity in these terms. So let's ask a very obvious question. What is it about human beings that makes us so interested in these big questions? Well, I think the answer is that nobody really knows. It just seems to be something that is built into our nature. And you may have read the novelist Jeanette Winterson, and she once remarked that, I quote, we cannot simply eat, sleep, hunt and reproduce. We are meaning-seeking creatures. And she goes on to point out that, again I quote, we seem to need some higher purpose, some point to our lives. Money, leisure, social progress are just not enough. So these ideas are important to us. Why is this the case? We don't really know, as I said. Some think the answer might lie in our evolutionary past. Others might say, well, look, we've got some kind of homing instinct for God as our creator, which makes us search for signs of transcendence or significance. And I'm sure there are other explanations as well. Yet, whatever explanation we offer, there's little doubt about how important this sense of meaning is for so many people. It does make a difference. Now, the idea of meaning is very often linked with worldviews. Worldviews are big pictures of reality. And I've mentioned Marxism as an example, and Christianity as one as well. They link individual aspects of life together into an interconnected whole. And the philosopher Keith Yandell suggests that a religion is, and I quote, a conceptual system that provides an interpretation of the world and the place of human beings in it. So if you like, these worldviews are like lenses. They allow us to see our world and ourselves more clearly, and they bring things into focus. Now, some worldviews are religious, but actually a lot are non-religious or even anti-religious, as in the case of two major secular worldviews of our own age, that is Marxism and Darwinism, particularly the form linked with Richard Dawkins. And each of these generates its own conception of meaning. And obviously, because I'm talking about Richard Dawkins tonight, I'm going to focus on Darwinism as Dawkins presents it, particularly in this idea of universal Darwinism. And for Dawkins, this is a narrative of purposelessness. It's a meaningless universe. And Dawkins uses the term Darwinism, I think, in two senses. One is simply to refer to Darwin's theory of the origins of biological diversity, and that's provisional, like any other scientific theory, open to constant revision and redirection, but also, in the second place, to a worldview based on this theory, which goes beyond the empirical evidence. And Dawkins introduced the term universal Darwinism back in 1983 to refer to his expanded vision of Darwinism, which is subsequently developed beyond the realm of biology to include explanations of cultural and intellectual phenomena, including, of course, religious belief and the question of purpose in life. And although Dawkins set out this universal Darwinist view in detail, mainly in his book The Blind Watchmaker in 1986, I think its most famous statement is found in the later book River Out of Eden, which explores a Darwinian view of life. And here's a quote which I think many of you listening to me will be familiar with. Let me read it to you. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Now, for Dawkins, religion is fatally compromised, and the main reason for this is its notion of faith. For Dawkins, faith is a refusal to consider evidence, a regression to infantile beliefs like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy, and a tendency to invent self-serving beliefs and try and fit in everything around them. So Dawkins, for example, will say that faith means blind trust, in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence. And Dawkins set out that view for the first time in 1976, and it's a core element of his attitude towards religion. I have to say it's not a very reliable understanding of religion, but as I'm talking about Dawkins, that's what I'll be looking at. In 1989, he went further. Faith was rather like a kind of mental illness. And again, in 1992, he took this a little bit further. Faith, he wrote, is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. Faith is not allowed to justify itself by argument. Now, Dawkins presents no evidence for that particular line of analysis. I have to say, having read many religious writers, I do not see any of them endorsing that particular position. You don't find it in Thomas Aquinas, you don't find it in C.S. Lewis, you don't find it in me, just to mention some obvious examples. It's something I think he's made up to kind of help his ideas along. But we need to be very, very clear. This is not what religion is about. However, happily, Dawkins is much more reliable in affirming the evidence-based character of scientific thinking, so happily we can agree on this. For me and for Dawkins, one of the great strengths of the natural sciences is their evidence-based approach to theories. In assessing theories, we identify the evidence that needs to be interpreted and then try to work out which theory is able to make the most sense of it. A very good example, of course, would lie in Einstein's brilliant theoretical explanation of the photoelectric effect, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics back in 1921. Now, Dawkins is suspicious of religious beliefs because they seem to involve a retreat from critical thinking or a disengagement from evidence-based reasoning. And his commitment to a scientific assessment of evidence leads him to adopt a very strongly critical attitude towards any beliefs that seem to be inadequately grounded in evidence. I agree with him that that's a bad thing. I mean, his own views about religion are not actually very well grounded in evidence, but we'll come back to that later. Now, this is why I think Dawkins embraces the warfare model of science and religion. He sees them as in competition in relation to the grounds of belief. But I have to say, I think, that he misunderstands what religious belief is all about on the one hand, and perhaps more interestingly fails to realize how many of the scientific ideas he considers to be facts are actually beliefs or judgments. I want to emphasize Dawkins is absolutely right to insist on the need for evidential foundations for belief, no matter what form those beliefs might take. And I very much hope he's willing to take the same position for his own beliefs. But I'm not sure Dawkins has entirely grasped the problem of circularity in scientific accounts of explanation. Let me explain what I mean by this. It's well known to philosophers of science who note the regular entanglement of evidence and belief. Let me explain this point in dialogue with the Cambridge philosopher of science, Peter Lipton, who I have to say is a very reliable guide to these issues. And Peter Lipton makes the point that very often you find that something is both cited as something needs to be proved and evidence for a theory at one and the same time. And a good example comes from modern cosmology. Lipton points out that the velocity of recession of a galaxy is held to explain why its spectrum is redshifted, yet the observation of that redshifted spectrum is often seen as an essential part of the evidence that the galaxy is receding. You see, the two things are entangled. It's not quite clear which is the chicken, which is the egg. The point that Peter Lipton makes is that self-evidencing explanations like that one exhibit a kind of epistemic circularity. And I could set us out like this. A explains B, but B justifies A. Now, let me make clear, there's nothing invalid or improper about this form of explanatory argument. It's widely encountered in scientific explanation. But my point here is that this is clearly a problem for Dawkins' rather naive view of the place of evidence in scientific thinking. And unfortunately, Dawkins doesn't seem to have read the literature that would alert him to the issue. So if you want to look at this in detail, please go to Peter Lipton's best-known book, Inference to the Best Explanation, which I think will give you a very good account of the issue and the problem that it raises, which is incidentally overlooked by Dawkins. So let's think more generally about science. In general terms, science is about what can be shown to be reliable interpretation of the world on the basis of evidence. Although we need to be careful about this, because I'm not quite sure Dawkins deals successfully with the obvious dilemma that we so often face as human beings and as scientists, namely not having enough evidence to prove a core belief. And as many of you will know, scientists regularly have to confront the problem of what is called the underdetermination of theory by evidence. The underdetermination of theory by evidence. In other words, the evidence is often insufficient to compel us to accept one theory over another, in that each theory has some evidential support. Now, for Dawkins, there is no room for faith in science, precisely because the evidence, in his view, compels us to draw the right conclusion. Let's look at a very bold statement of this position from the second edition of his very famous book, The Selfish Gene. in which Dawkins proposes an absolute dichotomy between blind faith and what he calls overwhelming, publicly available evidence. He writes, "But what, after all, is faith? It is a state of mind that leads people to believe something, it doesn't matter what, in the total absence of supporting evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway." Now, I agree with him completely. I concede the importance of good supporting evidence for beliefs, and I'm suspicious, like him, of those who resist submitting their beliefs to critical reflection. But I'm not sure it's quite as simple as Dawkins thinks. So why? Well, the issue that Dawkins here fails to make is the critically important distinction between the total absence of supporting evidence and, listen carefully, the absence of totally supporting evidence. Consider, for example, this debate within cosmology over whether the Big Bang gave rise to a single universe or to a series of universes. You probably know this as the multiverse hypothesis. Which is right? Well, the evidence is ambiguous. I know distinguished scientists in Oxford who support the former approach, and equally distinguished scientists who would take the latter. They believe they are right in making these judgments, but they can't prove that they are right. They're both real options for thinking and informed scientists who have to make a judgment, not something can be proved, but something that they think is right on the basis of their assessment of things, and they know they can't prove it to be right. There may be evidence for both beliefs, but there is compelling evidence for neither belief. And here scientists just have to make judgments about how best to make sense of evidence that is supportive of several possible conclusions. Now you see the point. Dawkins is being a bit simplistic here. I cannot help but feel that Dawkins overstates the ease with which scientists navigate their way from observations of our universe to theories about our universe, conveniently overlooking the serious intellectual difficulties raised by this very important point about the underdetermination of theory by evidence. Those of you who are into philosophy of science will know all about this already. But Dawkins, I think, is entirely right to highlight the importance of evidence-based thinking in science. And I think that is a very significant point. He and I are completely agreed on this. We need evidence-based thinking everywhere in life, science and faith. But there's another point I think we need to bring here in relation to Dawkins' views about science. And the point I'm going to make is that evidence accumulates over time. For example, through the development of new forms of scientific technology, which allow us to measure quantities that were once not accessible to us. For example, going back to what I was talking about earlier, the speed of recession of distant galaxies. And this technological advance in allowing us to see things which otherwise we couldn't has led to some occasionally spectacular changes in scientific thinking. And to give you a very good example, before the First World War, the dominant scientific understanding of our universe was that it had always existed and only changed in very superficial ways over time. But now it's all different. We believe the universe came into being about 13.8 billion years ago through the Big Bang. And that really is a massive change. But you know, that's how science works. It changes its mind as we acquire new evidence and develop better theories about our universe. So you can see the problem, I think. As both Karl Popper and Michael Polanyi, two good philosophers of science, point out, we can't be sure that today's best theories are true, because a better one may come along. Now, up to this point, I focused on Richard Dawkins because I find him to be a very interesting dialogue partner. I don't agree with him, but he is an excellent representative of the warfare or conflict model of the understanding of science and religion. And he certainly, I think, helps us to understand where it's coming from and some of the issues that I think we have to raise in connection with it. But I think it's time to move on. I want to move on now and look at the second broad approach, which I find in the writings of Albert Einstein. And clearly this is very different from what we find in Dawkins. For Einstein, science and religion are different. They are not incompatible, they are different, they don't interact, they are in effect different compartments of our minds. Now, in his God delusion, Dawkins tends to present Einstein as a closet atheist who was, and I quote, repeatedly indignant at the suggestion he was a theist. Now, Dawkins, unfortunately, gives us no evidence for that assertion, which actually is not backed up by Einstein's writings. Einstein made it very, very clear that what really annoyed him was the repeated suggestion that he was an atheist. Or he expresses regular irritation at being quoted by certain kinds of atheist writers as if he shared their views, particularly those who he termed, quote, fanatical atheists, with a grudge against traditional religion. But I think I can see why some people, including Richard Dawkins, thought Einstein was an atheist. It's all because of a rather hasty reading of Einstein's assertion he did not believe in a personal God. The point Einstein was making is he believed in the notion of God which was impersonal. But atheist apologists, unfortunately, quite regularly interpret this in terms of not believing in any God at all. The statement, I do not believe in a personal God, is taken to mean I don't believe in God. Einstein repeatedly and explicitly refers to in his works to an intelligence or mind or force which lies behind or beyond the universe and identifies this with God. Here's a good quote which I think gives you a flavour of what he thinks. I quote, "This firm belief in a superior mind that reveals itself in the world of experience represents my conception of God." So there you are. It's a mind behind the universe. That's what Einstein thinks God is all about. Now, Einstein actually thought the category of religion was really important. It's all about a sense of mystery in the presence of this mind that overwhelms us. But he was, I have to say, very critical of specific religions, such as Christianity and his own Judaism. There's no tension between being critical of religion and believing in religion. I think Einstein is very, very clear here that religion as a generic concept is a very good thing, even though you can criticize individual forms that it takes. So let's move on and think about Einstein on the relation of science and religion. He's very, very clear science and religion are different. And some would argue because they're different, they are incompatible. That's not what Einstein thinks. I'm going to explain to you what he says. Einstein, as I suggested earlier in this lecture, is best seen as a representative of the second broad category of approaches I noted towards science and religion, the independence or the silo model. So let's look at what Einstein has to say and see where this takes us. Einstein's approach is to treat science and religion as two distinct and different areas of human reflection, focusing on different aspects of our attitude to the universe. We want to know both how things work, but also what they mean. The first of these is certainly a scientific question, but the second is not. Now, in the lecture he gave at Princeton in May 1939, Einstein considered the limits of a rationalist way of thinking in dealing with the big questions of life. And his core aim here was to consider the relation of two different areas of human thought: science, which in his view deals with facts, and religion, which deals with values and meaning. And Einstein opens this very interesting lecture, which is well worth reading, by noting that during the 19th century it was widely held that there was an irreconcilable conflict between knowledge and belief. And this was, Einstein says, linked with the belief that a belief that did not itself rest on knowledge was simply superstition. Now, in developing his own distinct perspective, Einstein made the following statement about the limits of science. I quote, "The scientific method can teach us nothing beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other. The knowledge of what is does not open the door directly to what should be." In other words, Einstein is saying that science can tell us about what is, what we observe, but not about ethics, what ought to be. And many of you, I think, will recognize the views of the Edinburgh philosopher David Hume, who Einstein greatly admired, in what Einstein says. Because for Hume, there is no direct relationship between what actually happens in our world and questions of moral values, what we ought to believe or ought to do. For Einstein, we need both science and religion. They're different, but that does not make them incompatible. They deal with different and important areas of life. For Einstein, religion comes into play in identifying the proper goals of human life and motivating us to achieve those. This is what he says. One can have the clearest and most complete knowledge of what is, and yet not be able to deduce from that what should be the goal of our human aspirations. Both the identity of that goal and the motivation to achieve it, Einstein tells us, must come from another source. In other words, from a religious view of the world. Now, Einstein draws a clear distinction between science, ethics, politics, and religion. He makes the point these are all different, but again, this does not mean they are incompatible. Each uses different methods. Each is important to human existence. They may have little to say to each other, but we can weave them together to give a bigger picture of life, looking at, for example, questions of value and meaning. Now, if I have read them both correctly, there's a very clear parallel between Einstein and Stephen Jay Gould. Gould, of course, developed the idea of non-overlapping magisteria, which holds that science and religion are to be compartmentalized. And Gould, of course, was a very prominent American evolutionary biologist, and he did not want science to interfere in religion or religion to interfere in science. This is what Gould has to say on this matter, and I quote, "If religion can no longer dictate the nature of factual conclusions properly under the magisterium of science, then scientists cannot claim higher insight into moral truth from any superior knowledge of the world's empirical constitution. This mutual humility has important practical consequences in a world of such diverse passions." Now, Einstein is actually saying something very similar. He's suggesting it's important for us to understand both how a universe functions and also what it means. But he sees these as totally independent lines of intellectual exploration. If you like, they occupy separate intellectual silos. But here's my question. Should they? I think this is a really interesting question. Let me tell you what I think and let you take it on from there. Part of me feels that so long as we give science, politics, ethics, and religion due attention, it doesn't really matter whether we see them as disconnected or connected. But part of me does worry about this, because it seems to lead to the fragmentation of reality. I've often been impressed by a remark of the American philosopher John Dewey. Now, people don't read Dewey very much these days, which I think is a shame, but it's very easy to see why he was so influential in the past. Because for Dewey, the, quote, deepest problem of modern life is that we have failed to integrate our thoughts about the world with our thoughts about value and purpose. Now listen, Dewey's a philosopher, so he could easily be wrong here, but nevertheless I do think he's made a good point. Can we hold our thoughts about the world together with our thoughts about value and purpose? Now, Einstein himself, of course, was deeply concerned about the ethical aspects of science, and he held that scientists should try to be ethical people. I think that's a very important point. Science can be used to do some terrible things. And like Dewey, Einstein did not want science and ethics to be divorced or detached. But the point is that on Einstein's understanding of science, ethical beliefs simply cannot be established scientifically. So what Einstein is saying, that scientists, in order to be ethical people, have to, in effect, rely on something beyond science to bring them to that position. Now, again, some might argue that because science and ethics are different, they are, for that reason, incompatible. But as I think is very clear, Einstein would not agree. They're simply different, but they need to inform each other and to be woven together in the lives and the thought of active scientists. So that's the second major position, the compartmentalization or the silo view of the relation of science and religion. It recognizes the importance of science and religion but wants to keep them separate. And I agree, actually. For example, let's keep politics out of science. I dislike political interference in science. And as I know from countless conversations with intelligent people over the last 50 years, being a scientist does not determine what you think ethically, politically, or religiously. The scientific method does not require you to adopt any specific ethical, religious, anti-religious, or political creed. And that, I think, is a very important point. Now, I've always been impressed by a quote from Thomas H. Huxley, who was both a friend and a great supporter of Charles Darwin. And Huxley made this point in 1885. He declared that science, I quote, commits suicide when it adopts a creed. Now, I think this is a very perceptive statement. Huxley was not simply noting the dangers which might arise when science becomes a servant of the church or some kind of religious ideology. He was saying any ideology, any organization is in effect something that could subvert what science is all about. Science could become the prisoner of some ideology, which of course is what happened in Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. And for Huxley, science has no creed. But interestingly, he says it does have one and only one article of faith. I wonder what you think that might be. Here's what Huxley himself says. The one act of faith in the convert to science is the confession of the universality of order and of the absolute validity in all times and under all circumstances of the law of causation. And this confession is an act of faith because by the nature of the case, the truth of such propositions is not susceptible of proof. Now, I think he's putting something very interesting into words here. He's pointing out the circularity of this idea. Science depends on this order, but can't prove this order. Yet you could say the success of science shows it's reliable. I think he makes a good point there. But whether you agree or not with him, I think he's opened up a very important question about the place of faith in science. Because, as Huxley notes, faith, meaning an act of trust that goes beyond the evident, is not limited to religion. So I can see merits with this second approach to the relation of science and faith. Keeping them separate does make a lot of sense. But I think I can also see some problems. And here's my big concern. This approach seems to me to prevent, or at least to discourage, the integration of our thoughts about how our world works with what it actually means. And Einstein himself, interestingly, was a very strong advocate of intellectual unification, holding what might seem to be disparate and disconnected ideas together in a grander vision of reality. Now, in the end, of course, Einstein failed to find that elusive unification of scientific theories, but nevertheless, he thought it was a goal worth achieving. Now, my own preference is for an approach which allows any aspect of human thought to engage in dialogue with others. I don't like intellectual isolationism or the formation of academic ghettos, because intellectual isolationism too easily leads into intellectual arrogance. As I've looked at the views of Dawkins and Einstein, which I hope you find interesting, I'm going to now tell you about the third approach, which is the one that I think is right. And this is the idea that you can have a dialogue between science and religion. So let me try and explain what I mean by that, and again offer you what I think might be its strengths and its weaknesses. As I mentioned earlier, I was a scientist when I was a student at the Methodist College Belfast back in the late 1960s, and I went on to win a scholarship to study chemistry at Oxford University. And that was great fun. And I specialised in quantum theory, which helped me to get to know the writings of Einstein really well. And then I went on to do doctoral research at Oxford under the supervision of Professor Sir George Rader, this time in the biological sciences. And while I was a teenager, I was an atheist, but I moved away from that while I was at Oxford and embraced Christianity instead. So you could say my own personal history leads me to be interested in the possible dialogue between science and religion, because in effect it raised questions for me I had to answer. Let me begin then by saying that it seems to me a dialogue has to begin by recognizing the differences between science and religion. They're not the same. It's a critical and constructive dialogue. It's not a cozy and uncritical conversation. And at least as I understand it, a dialogue is about an exchange, an interaction that is critical in its nature, even if it may end up being constructive in its outcomes. Now, like all of the approaches I've looked at tonight, this has merits and difficulties. So let me look at some of these. On the positive side, it means you have to become informed about both. And as an educationalist, I do see this as a virtue. Yeah, I think more profoundly, it allows you a deeper grasp of our complex world. It allows you to bring different research tools to bear on it. If I use a very simple analogy, if you look at our world through one lens, you see things in 2 dimensions. But if you use 2 lenses, it allows you stereoscopic vision. And for me, one of the most important questions is how we can represent our complex world properly without reductive distortion. And that means we need to look at our world using different lenses. But there are problems too, and let me mention one very obvious problem, which is how on earth can we hold multiple insights together? Science and religion give us different ideas. How do we weave these together? Now, the philosopher Mary Midgley, for whom I've got a lot of admiration, argues that we have to recognize there's a need for a pluralism of approaches to our world. Our world is complex, and we just need to face up to that. And she makes this point in her final book, What is Philosophy For? Here's what she has to say. On the one hand, I want to emphasize that there really is only one world, but also on the other, that this world is so complex, so various, that we need dozens of different thought patterns to understand it. We can't reduce all these ways of thinking to one single model. Instead, we have to use all our philosophical tools to bring these distinct kinds of thought together. Now, I hope you can see the point she's making. Science can't answer all our questions about life. It's very good at answering scientific questions, but not moral, existential, or religious questions, particularly those dealing with meaning or values in life. So how then do we move from recognizing a plurality of insights, which I think you see in the second approach I mentioned tonight, to a more integrated vision of the world? And Mary Midgley uses the metaphor of maps to capture the many aspects of reality and to resist inadequate reductionist accounts of its complexity. So Midgley develops this very interesting idea that we need to use multiple maps to represent a complex reality. Each of these maps is incomplete in itself. In our attempts, we try to make as much sense of we can of our world, and we draw maps to try and indicate what we've discovered. But we need multiple maps because each of these maps is inadequate in itself. So think about an atlas, which provides us with many maps of a region, for example, Europe. But why do we need multiple maps of such landscapes in the first place? And Midgley's point is that different maps provide different information about the same reality. And we need multiple maps of reality because each mapping is incomplete. It focuses on some specific question that's being asked and not others. So, for example, think of a physical map of Europe, which shows us the features of its landscapes, or a political map of Europe, which shows us the borders of its nation states. The first of those might be very useful to a tourist who wants to find some nice mountains or lakes, but the second is going to be useful to a refugee seeking asylum. Do you see the point? Midgley's point is that there is only one world but a big one, and it needs therefore many maps to justice to its vast scope and range, and to the multiple interests and concerns of those using the maps. Now I think you can see how this works out in the case of science and faith. Science maps our world at one level, explaining how it functions. Religion maps our world at another level, explaining what it means. And we need to superimpose those maps so that all this information is at our disposal. My point is that each map needs to be respected, but it does depend on a specific way of exploring our world, and for that reason is incomplete. It needs supplementation with other maps. Again, coming back to this point, a scientific map would help us to understand how we as human beings function, and that's important medically. But a theological map will help us to understand our deeper needs, and that's important spiritually. Now I must end, not because I've solved the problems, but because I've simply run out of time. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of intellectual possibilities and my reflection on these themes. And my feeling is that we all place ourselves somewhere along the spectrum of three broad areas I've sketched out tonight. But as I end, I need to highlight the importance of the question we've been looking at, and it's this: meaning matters. I think that one of the most interesting psychological, philosophical and religious questions we can ask is whether we simply invent a universe that suits our tastes and needs, or whether we try to respond to the way we believe the universe actually is and adapt our tastes and needs and beliefs accordingly. But that's a big question, and that's for another lecture, I'm afraid. But thank you very much indeed for listening to this one tonight. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. And thank you also for agreeing to answer some questions in the Q&A. We've got just one or two so far, but we expect to get a few more coming in due course. The first one here is actually from Germany, Julian in Germany, and I hope, Julian, it's okay to shorten your question a little, and it's concerning, for Professor McGrath, hypothesis formation. Is it the case that formulating a hypothesis is itself a guess and therefore essentially a matter of faith?
Well, Julian, thank you very much indeed for what I think is a great question to begin our discussion tonight. And so you're asking us to imagine a scientist who's seen something, who's observed something, and saying, how on earth can I explain this? And so the question is, how do we develop hypotheses? I think the answer is that actually we develop these sometimes as guesses, sometimes because we've seen something like this somewhere else and we think it might work here as well. So in one sense, the hypothesis is an act of faith. I think this might work, but I don't know. And you then begin the process of testing it. And if you like, the process by which we invent possible ideas like hypotheses is about saying, I think this is worth trying, but then you begin to test them against the empirical evidence, and that leads you to say that one doesn't seem to work, but this one does. So if you like, there's an element of faith in saying this way of thinking might well make sense of this, but we've got to test it out. So it's not, if you like, blind faith. It's very much saying the whole way we're going to understand things is by saying, let's test this idea out. We've got to, as it were, propose the idea to begin with and then develop it. So it's a good question because it raises this question of how we go about testing out different ways of looking at our world. And we're not just talking about scientific hypotheses here. We're talking about, for example, the way in which we check out worldviews. For example, I mentioned Marxism, I mentioned Christianity and various others. And one of the questions you're going to be asking is, how do I test these things out? And one very obvious way of doing it is to see how well they map onto what we observe in the world around us and what we experience within us. So I think there's a very interesting way here in which we can expand this to look at some of the deeper questions of life and not just scientific ones. I'm a great admirer of the English writer C.S. Lewis. I'm sure many in this audience are. And C.S. Lewis once famously said that he came to faith by induction. What he meant by that was he had a number of possible ways of looking at our world, and in the end he felt that Christianity was the best way of making sense of things. If you like, there were various explanations, but this seemed to be the best. But there's a lot more needs to be said, but that's a short answer to a very good question, and I'm sure that there are more to take us on further.
Thank you. Yes, another question from Murray here, and it's a question of miracles and pointing out that miracles are a problem for some people in considering Christianity. Science does not require the existence of miracles. Without them, we could conclude the universe is random. So the only way, if God, if he exists, could get our attention would be to break the natural order. The question then, are miracles essential evidence for God? And if so, how can someone who's not experienced a miracle be expected to believe in God?
Well, thank you, Murray. That's a wonderful question. It's also a very big question, I'm afraid, but let's see how we get on. I'm not in Edinburgh, but a lot of you are in Edinburgh tonight. And of course, the great philosopher of Edinburgh is David Hume. And David Hume famously said that, a miracle is something that breaks a law of nature. And I think that's an interesting way of thinking about this, because it's only one way of thinking about what a miracle is. Another way is to say that, in effect, a miracle is about doing something that goes beyond the natural capacity of nature. And that's very, very different. I'm always struck by something Isaac Newton once said, and he was reflecting on the idea of miracle. He said, look, supposing we saw a miracle happen every day, we would just get so used to it that actually we take it for granted. And I think that's a very important point, because there is a sense in which actually life is quite miraculous. We've got so used to it, we don't really appreciate for what it is. So one of the points I would want to make is that we need to look at our world more attentively and begin to realize that many of the things we take for granted actually are really very special. Now, maybe the word miracle isn't the right word to use, but I think nevertheless it just helps remind us that actually when you look at the intricacy and beauty of our world, it really is very special. And I think that, taking a sort of Christian lens and looking at nature's creation makes you very, very appreciative of that. But your question goes deeper than that. Your question really was about whether God needs to use miracles to kind of way give us a wake-up call. There's something special has to happen that highlights our attention. And maybe that's true for some people. For me, it wasn't, I'm afraid. In my own case, which is not, of course, representative, but it just the way my own thinking developed. It wasn't so much here's something I can't explain that's attracted my attention. It was much more the fact that we can explain anything is actually astonishing. I quoted Einstein earlier, and Einstein had a very famous quote. He said, the fact, explicability, the fact we can explain things is very mysterious. Why on earth can we do that? That needs explanation. And again, Einstein said it has to say something about the deep structure of the universe. And in the end, Einstein gave quite a religious answer to that. In my own case, what really moved me was not so much something that was miraculous, but rather my realization that Christianity gave me this intellectual way of looking at the world, which was very, very exciting and seemed to work. And obviously, since then, I've gone beyond that. I no longer see Christianity as sense-making, but it was kind of the way in for me. It's where we got my thinking started. So that's quite important to me. So thank you, Mary, for a great question.
Next question, another one from Germany, from Johannes, the common Johannes. He says he finds it interesting and ironic that how some of his colleagues, mainly physicists, deny the existence of any kind of God or religion, but they somehow tend to believe in the power of science. And he's wondering if that becomes a religion, and he's wondering if he himself may be a little bit hypocritical in criticizing religion, if he himself maybe tends towards this view.
Johannes, thank you very much. That's a good question. I have some friends who are string theorists, and I mean, I love talking to them, but I very often get the impression that the theory has to be right. That kind of whatever you observe can be fitted into this theory. It's almost as if there's kind of no question of what its evidential basis is. It's just right. And I find myself there thinking, isn't this almost like a kind of religion, that this seems to be impervious to critical examination? So I think what I would say is this, that I have no objection to people who criticize religion. It's just that I hope people will ask whether they could make the same criticisms of their own position. One of the points I make against Richard Dawkins, I mentioned it briefly in this talk tonight, was that he makes some criticisms about religion, for example, its reliance on faith, not being able to prove certain things, and yet in his own writings he also produces a whole series of statements which actually lie beyond proof, particularly moral values and things like that. And my concern is that he's using criteria to criticize other people that he's not using against himself. And for me, the really interesting question here came out in a very interesting debate between Dawkins and Rowan Williams, who was then Archbishop of Canterbury at Oxford in 2012. And the issue which emerged was, could Dawkins actually prove that his own views were right? In other words, atheism was right. It just didn't work out. I mean, Dawkins in the end said, look, I can't prove this. I'm into this, but I can't actually prove it's right. And I think that's a very telling insight. I think Dawkins is right. But in many ways, what Dawkins is helping us to see there is that actually, in one sense, the kind of things that we can prove are sometimes rather trivial truths, like 2 and 2 make 4. When it comes to big questions like the meaning of life is whatever you think it is, or, the nature of goodness is this, and therefore I will act in this way, you are making a judgment which is not proven by the evidence. And so a very famous example is the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, who was absolutely clear that you could not resolve the God question by philosophy or by science, but he took an atheist position and said, this is my lifestyle choice. I've chosen to live like this, even though I can't actually prove I'm right. Now, I welcome Russell's absolute honesty. I can't prove this, but this is the way I'm going to live. And actually, I think that's true of every worldview. I mean, this will be controversial, I know, but when I was an atheist myself, one of the things I began to realize was I couldn't prove I was right. That I assumed that my Christian friends were simply wrong because they couldn't prove their core beliefs, but I failed to see that I needed to apply that criticism to myself as well. So maybe there is a case for all of us, whether we're scientists or not, just asking whether we're being completely consistent in the way in which we judge ourselves and other people's positions. But that was a great question, Johannes. Thank you very much.
One from John here. If God is infinite, are there an infinite number of maps? Picking up the map, Midgley's map parallel.
Well, John, that's a great question, and I'm going to have to tell you I don't know what the answer is, but I'll tell you what I think the answer is. What I think is that actually there's a very important aspect here, which is that actually while I believe in God, I'm also me, and I find that God speaks to me in certain ways. For example, to me, it's very, very important that the idea of God helps me make sense of the world. For me, it's very important that the idea of God gives me purpose. And for other people, different things may be really important. If you read religious biographies, you very often find that what draws people to faith is, the need for security, the need for explanation, or a deep sense, this is right, this is what I ought to be doing. But actually, they are quite different. And so if you like, each of us, I think, probably draws our own map in which we place God. So what I'm trying to say is not that we construct God, but rather we respond to God in different ways. And I could draw a map of the way in which I respond to God, the way in which I understand God, the way in which I, if you like, categorize God. And so could everybody listening to this lecture. And when we compare those maps, I think they'll be different. And that's not a bad thing, because one of the central themes of Christianity in many ways is that God relates to us as individuals. And therefore that means that God meets each of our deepest needs and aspirations. And because we're different, it means that God will meet different needs and aspirations in each case. But your question is good actually in another way as well, John. I think if I can make another point, I think that if God is indeed infinite, it means that there's no way we're going to express in words what God is fully like. Our words are always going to be inadequate. And therefore, what we need to realize, I think, is that we can talk about God. We can talk about the love of God. We can talk about God as a shepherd, but we must make sure we don't reduce God to simply being a shepherd. There's always more to God than these images, these ways of thinking. Even though they're good and reliable, we mustn't limit God to what these individual images convey. Now, much more needs to be said, but that was really interesting. Thank you very much, John.
There is a question here which I believe there is a question here which I believe you've already covered about what led you from atheism to Christianity. Next one, what do you think is the definition of knowledge? What do you think of the definition of knowledge as justified through belief?
What do I think of the idea that knowledge is justified belief? I think that I could give a very boring response, which would be about definitions of what we mean by justification and things like that. So I'll try and avoid that while at the same time answering your question. I mean, for me, there is always going to be this question about what counts as opinion, what counts as knowledge. And if you like, that is a very important thing, because morally, we feel that knowledge has a higher status, is more appropriate. That actually, when I say I know something, it means it's not just an opinion, it's something that is right. And all of us clearly are trying to find our way to beliefs that are right, that are justifiable, or in some cases can actually be proven. The difficulty is it proves much more difficult to justify some beliefs than you might think. I think that that's the critical thing I want to say. The critical thing I'm going to say is we have to learn to live with this tension that beliefs that really matter in life actually lie beyond proof. We can give good reasons for thinking they're right, so in that sense they're justified, but we can't actually give absolute proof. Proof for me would be limited to questions of mathematics and logic and some areas of science, like for example showing that the chemical structure of water is H2O. But actually knowing that water is H2O or the 2 and 2 make 4 don't actually answer deep questions like, why am I here? What am I meant to be doing? And so what I'm going to say to you is that this debate's been going on since Plato, really. Plato has a distinction between doxa, which is about opinion, and episteme, which is about knowledge. And he's constantly trying to find what is about something that can be trusted. I think that the key point I'm going to make here is that it's not just a question about whether a belief is right. I think that's a very important question. It's also whether a belief can be trusted. In other words, if I trust this belief, what is it going to do for me? What is it going to do to me? And one of the things that I see in theologians is this idea that belief in God is not just something that can be counted as knowledge, but it is transformative. If you like, it's not just knowing that there is a God, it is knowing in the sense of relating to this God and thus being transformed by this God. So actually it goes deeper than this old and very important philosophical question about distinction between belief and knowledge. It's actually about a truth that transforms. And so for me, that's a really interesting question, because, I could say, well, knowing a scientific truth, like, for example, the chemical formula of water, doesn't actually transform my life, but there are some things about life that do change me completely. And somehow we've got to try and find our way into a way of thinking about the world that we believe is right, but also enables us to cope with the complexities of life, which of course many of us think are feeling right now in this very difficult COVID situation, when the question we're very often asking is simply, how do we cope with this? And that's why the Christian idea of God being our shepherd, who's always with us even in dark times, actually is really quite important at this point. Now again, much more needs to be said, but that's just the kind of beginnings of an answer to a very good question.
So next question. From Stuart and Mullig. Since each person has a unique point of view, do we need a pluralist method of understanding the world and the universe in which we live?
Well, Stuart, thank you. Again, that's a really interesting question. And I suppose we could say, well, we just say everybody is right. So therefore, we try to add all these things together and say that's the way the world is. And it'd be a nice thing to do, but I think it might be an unwise thing to do, because I myself have believed some things that turned out to be quite seriously weird and needed to be challenged. And also I have some friends who I have great respect for, but they do have some ideas that I do have some doubts about. And so I think what we need to do is find a way of having a gracious, constructive conversation about what you think, what I think, and trying to see what we can reach agreement on. And if we disagree on something, then we try to figure out which of us is right, realizing that actually we both may end up being wrong. So I think it's very important to find something which allows us to have these critical conversations. And in my view, our culture at the moment doesn't really want that to happen. Our culture doesn't really seem to be able to cope with the idea of having these principled, civilized conversations. Very often is to do with rhetoric rather than argument. And I very much regret that. But the answer is no, I don't think we need a pluralism. I think there are some points where a plurality of positions is quite possible, but there are others where, in effect, we are looking at right versus wrong. In other words, they can't be right. They can't all be wrong. We've got to choose something. And to me, the difficulty is trying to figure out which of these is right. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think science is so important, because science, if you take the great debates about whether we have a multiverse, whether we have a single universe, it doesn't make all that much difference to us, but actually it's very important in terms of scientific theorizing, and the evidence isn't good enough to allow us to reach a decision, to say, you're right, I'm wrong. But there are good reasons for thinking each of them might be right. And therefore, scientists are entitled to take positions on either side of that discussion, even though the evidence is not conclusive. Maybe in 20 years' time, things will look different, but I think we have to live with a certain degree of tension here. Thank you.
A question here from Matthew. Why do you think that the warfare or conflict model resonates so strongly in the modern world? And then how, in this world of sound bites and tweets, do we attempt to give a dialogical approach more airtime?
Oh, Matthew, that's we're having some wonderful questions tonight. Thank you very much. If I go back, I'm going back a very long way to when I was 16. I was very much into the warfare narrative then. And I think actually one of the reasons I was into it was that it enabled me to say, look, they're the good guys and there are the bad guys, and I'm a good guy. Or to put it even more strongly, there are idiots and they're intelligent people, and I'm one of the intelligent people. If you like, it's a way of, in effect, placing yourself within a group of people who are the elite, the best, the right people. And so we do this all the time, I'm afraid. And that's one of the things I think social media has not helped with at all. It's kind of this demonization of people you don't agree with. It's this kind of elevation of yourself and not being prepared to accept others. So if you're someone like Richard Dawkins, then I can see why he in effect is so rude about religion, how he treats people of faith as having no intellectual merits whatsoever. But it is a very self-justifying position, and that's what concerns me. If you like, he's insulating himself. He's kind of constructing an impenetrable barrier between him and the world. And the world is actually rather more complicated than he thinks. And that's one of the things I think that we keep coming back to, which is that, as I was saying in the lecture, science and religion are different. That's very, very clear. But that does not mean that one is therefore right and the other is therefore wrong. It just means that they come at things from different angles and they may have important things to say. And one of the things I've learned the hard way, I'm afraid, is that you always need to be open to alternative perspectives precisely because you might be wrong. I try to do that. I try to say, look, I think I've sorted things out, but I do need to keep reading and keep thinking because I might have made a mistake. So if you like, I think it's a good thing to do in terms of our own humility. But I think the appeal of the warfare model is very much to do with privileging one community of discourse over another. And my feeling is that the history of it just doesn't bear that out. And I think we'd have a much more positive conversation if we kind of set these outdated stereotypes to one side and moved on. Thank you.
Thank you. A question here about the Midgley map. A Midgley map of science will deal with the material world of external objectivity. Is it not true, the questioner asked, that the religious map deals not with the world out there, but only the inner world with questionable objective reality?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and again, it would take a long time for me to give a full answer to it, but I think it's a very interesting question. What I'd want to say is that there's always this danger that we kind of way invent worlds we'd like to inhabit. In effect, we simply decide in advance the way we would like the world to be, and then live that out. And when I was an atheist, I wanted the world to be like that. When I was a Christian, I think I want the world to be like that. And there's always a danger, whatever our ways of thinking are, that we have to challenge ourselves to check we haven't simply imposed upon the world our own set of beliefs. But I think what Midgley is highlighting here is a very interesting point, which is that a purely objective approach to life in terms of clinically precise mathematical quantities, in terms of a very objective approach to the natural world, leaves something out. It's incomplete. That's the kind of attitude Mary Midgley adopts, that the danger is not that we will get something wrong, but we'll leave something out. I think that is very important, because if you like, a map of faith is saying each of us matters individually, and our subjective feelings matter profoundly, that our subjective worlds are important, that they're important to each of us. My subjective world is different to yours, but yours is important to you, mine's important to me, and we need to be able to map those and figure out how, for example, science or religion actually relate to this very important subjective world. Now, if there are any existentialist philosophers listening to me tonight, they will say, well, look, this is really important to us, because what makes us different is this subjective aspect to our existence, and we need to really take that very, very seriously. So I'd want to echo that and say that in some way we need to be able to make connections between our ways of thinking about the world and our inner world. And I think that that's something that we can do. We need to actually be aware that it needs to be done. So in effect, it's not just looking at, for example, a landscape or a starry night and saying, oh, I can name those stars and identify their distance from Earth and so on. It's in effect saying, oh, that is so wonderful. I feel a sense of wonder and awe at the immensity and beauty of the night sky. That's part of the experience of looking at the night sky as well. And somehow we need to hold together objective knowledge about the world and this subjective reality as well.
Right, now we have enough questions here to keep us going for another 45 minutes, I would estimate. So I'm afraid I think this really will have to be our last one. We've already gone slightly longer than we had anticipated. So thank you so much for all the questions. The last one I have here is from Andrew in Toronto, and he's looking about how things were in the past. In our past, did we ever look at science and spirituality, religion, as being together and not separate? And if that is so, then what could we learn from previous approaches?
Well, Andrew in Toronto, thank you very much for a very good question. The answer is yes, that in the past, if we go back, for example, to the 17th century, that's when something which is called natural philosophy began to become very important. We're talking about Kepler, Galileo, Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton. And all of these saw an interconnection between investigating the natural world and, through that investigation, coming to appreciate and better understand the nature of God. In other words, that in effect that they were doing what we would now call science, although they didn't call it by that name, but they did not dissociate that from, in effect, a deeper understanding of God. And the argument was, look, we're investigating the creation. The more we understand about creation, the better we appreciate God. Therefore, to engage the natural world is actually to gain an enhanced appreciation of what God is like and what life is all about. Now, obviously, we can't just go back to the past. We have to ask some questions about why we've moved on. But sometimes we leave things behind that we shouldn't have left behind. And I sometimes wonder whether the approach we find in Newton or Kepler actually is one that we could bring back to life today, not in any way playing down the importance of science, which is wonderful, but just saying, look, science actually is incomplete. It doesn't give us a full understanding of what life is all about. So we need to find some way of enriching a scientific vision and being able to figure out not just how we and our world works, but what we mean as well. So the answer is that was done in the past. And, you know, I think we could do it again. Maybe we can learn, and maybe we can we retrieve something from the not so distant past.
Well, I think that's a great question to answer on, and a great answer to finish on as well. And we're just tremendously grateful to Professor McGrath for his time this evening and for his engagement with those questions. And again, sorry to those many people who have put questions in and where we just don't have the time. But now I would like to call upon our Deputy Principal for Education and Student Life, the new title, and it's Professor John Sawkins, who is now going to give the vote of thanks.
Thanks. Well, it's my very great pleasure on behalf of everyone participating in tonight's lecture to offer Aleister our sincere thanks for helping us once more to explore the interface of science and religion. And I think I speak for us all when I say this has been brought to life, Aleister, by seeing matters in the light of the work of Dawkins and Einstein, and of course your own thinking and work too. So thanks for that. One of the many strands that stood out for me was the need to view the world through the lens of both science and religion. We need to have more than one map. We need to build a more integrated view of the world, ensuring that the conversations which have all too often taken place in separate spaces are in fact joined up. And this is what we seek to do in the chaplaincy lecture year after year. And it's perhaps only in this way that we will advance our understanding of what it means to be human, how we relate to each other, and how we inhabit the earth. And as I close, can I also say how pleased we are that so many have been able to share in this event online. As those of you who are regular attenders at the chaplaincy lecture will know, we book out and fill our largest lecture theatre at the Edinburgh campus year after year. And this year we have been able to share the lecture with many more than we would have been able to fit into that lecture theatre. And of course, we have the added advantage of being able to attend from where we live, rather than having to make our way through the snow, which is, as I speak, settling at the campus now. The usual way to end a vote of thanks is to invite a round of applause, of course. That's rather hard to do in this online space. But as I close, let me invite you all to join me in a virtual round of applause as we thank Aleister once again for his lecture, a real high point of this very special year for us. Our thanks once again. Thank you all, and good night.